I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. The ongoing case, the trial of Noel Long for the murder of Nora Sheehan. You were down there today, Clodagh. What happened?
So today we heard evidence from former state pathologist Dr Marie Cassidy, whom many of us will be familiar with. Now she was a state pathologist from 2004 until she retired in 2018. So what happened in this case was the original pathologist who conducted the post-mortem on the body of Nora Sheehan passed away in August of 1981, so just 2 months after Nora's death. Now he had written a report, a post-mortem report about what he's seen on the body, the injuries he observed, outside and inside the body. With these typical reports, they describe the person, their height, their, various observations. And they record that in both a report, in photographs, and in what are called body sketches. So it's kind of like that outline of body, and they have arrows and various things pointing to where on the body they've seen different injuries or bruises or cuts or whatever it might be. So he didn't actually sign that report before he died. And what happened then was Dr Harbison did another report, who was the state pathologist after Dr Coakley. Now, Dr Coakley wasn't actually ever a state pathologist. He was just a pathologist in a hospital. There is a difference between, obviously the forensic pathologist is called out when there is, suspicious about the circumstances of a death. Particularly in this case where there's obviously an unnatural death, you can see by the body that that's not somebody who died naturally. She was found on the side of a road. She was partially naked. She had a dress pulled up over her head, and she was naked other than a pair of tights that were kind of just down on one foot. So today, Dr Cassidy summarised...
Called by the defence.
She was called by the defence, which was surprising. She summarised the report that she wrote for the Serious Crime Review team back in 2010. Now, she did 2 reports. Her first one was kind of working on the report that was unsigned by Dr Coakley, the photographs that he had taken of the body in situ at the crime scene, but also from the morgue. And as well as that, she was able to use those body sketches to kind of work through those with the forensic mind and try and come to a conclusion about how Miss Sheehan had died, because there was no kind of conclusion given by Dr Coakley. So she was called by the defence, who essentially wanted to prove or show, and it is their job to do so, to show that there was no cause of death really determined by Dr Cassidy or by any pathologist in the case. However, she did kind of go into some different hypotheses when cross-examined by the prosecution about how Miss Sheehan may have died. So she basically, she examined those materials, and she came up with her own report. So in that report, she spoke about the findings from Dr Coakley, which were that when he got to the scene, now he visited the scene on the 12th, which is the day she was found, in the evening, and kind of did an examination of the body where it was, and then returned the next day to kind of oversee the removal of the body to the hospital for post-mortem, which Dr Cassidy says is a very standard procedure. So he initially observed that her head was covered by clothing and the rest of her body was naked with tights on the right foot. So that's that dress I said. Now, that dress was, it had a zip on the back, and that zip was still in place. And the neck of the dress was kind of pulled up over her kind of around her mouth, and it was actually pulled up so tightly it had caused bruising around her mouth. Dr Coakley observed that the body was cold. There was flies, there was eggs and maggots, which would suggest that the scene, she had lain there for a number of days. There was rodent damage, which was heartbreaking to have to hear in the presence of the family. He also said that there was a small blood stain in the lower part of her nose. Kind of when he went through the autopsy, he knew that there was a small blood stain and some mucus in the lower part of her nose. Her upper lip was bruised and swollen, and her lower lip was pale. Her head and neck and upper shoulder was a dirty red colour. Her nose is bruised. She had bruising on both her cheeks. She had what was described as a triangular area of pallor between her nose and mouth. Her gums and mouth were also bruised. She had a strap bruise running from the left of her mouth along her lower jaw. She had bone exposed on her chin from the rodents. There was bruising under and behind an ear. There was, lots of bruising. There was small hemorrhages on the skin at the base of her neck, superficial scratches on her shoulders, so on her back and on her buttocks. And again, we heard that she was found with her dress kind of up over her head. So these scratches, Dr. Cassidy concluded, would be because the body was dragged at some point. There was bruising at the back of the legs as well. There was various bruises on her upper arms, scratches. There was also bruising on her spinal column and bruising on the anterior wall of her vagina, which we heard. And also there was spermatoza found in her vagina. So the state's case was that she was murdered. And when asked about asphyxiation, she said that there was no evidence of asphyxiation on the body because it usually causes petechial hemorrhaging, which is, if you can imagine, it's like small blood vessels that burst in your eyes. So think when you have a really bad cough and you can almost feel like your eyes are bursting out of your head. It's that sort of, because it's from the pressure of not being able to breathe and your, the lungs being cut off from air. There was none of that. But she did say that because of the bruising on the mouth and the kind of that area, she concluded that it was possible that she had been, that oxygen while she couldn't conclude exactly the cause of death, she did suggest that it was possible that she was smothered by either her head being pressed into a pillow or a mattress or something of that nature, or hands being placed over her mouth.
Okay.
There was bruising on her face. She did note as well that there was no internal trauma. So while there was evidence on the body that there was some degree of force that may have been caused by an assault, there wasn't sufficient enough damage, I suppose, to cause any much interior damage to the body.
And all that evidence from Dr. Cassidy is her interpretation, or rather her professional interpretation, of the original report.
Absolutely.
So we're all everything has been based on what's in the original report, because she's coming to this case 30 years later, yeah?
At this point it was 30 years later. So again, and she hasn't seen the body, so she had to go on what she's seen in the report and her professional opinion and her years and years of experience in what she sees in different cases and, different causes of death. There was while she noted there was no detailed evidence of the description of her heart, she couldn't exclude that she suffered a heart attack due to the arrhythmia or something of that nature. There was no evidence of blocked arteries either. So, obviously, there was no evidence that she'd been shot or stabbed either. And
all these questions were put to her?
All these questions were put to her during the course of the defence asking questions and the course of then the prosecution cross-examining, because they also have an opportunity to ask whatever questions they want.
So she's the last witness?
She is the last witness in the case,
right.
Yes. The case went into a little bit of legal argument, which meant that the jury were sent home. We are returning to the courtroom tomorrow, where it is expected that the closing arguments will get underway. The closing statements.
And just to go back a little bit, and we haven't spoken, you've been covering this case, you've been down covering it, but we haven't had a chance to catch up on it. But just to kind of go back to what this case is all about, and I think, in his opening speech, Brendan Grehan, Senior Counsel, described her a little bit and described this case a little bit. Yeah,
so Brendan Grehan, who is Senior Counsel for the prosecution, opened the case where he outlined the facts of what the jury were going to hear, what evidence they were going to hear and what witnesses they were going to hear from on the stand. So he said that on the night of June 6th, 1981, Nora Sheehan had gone missing. She lived with her husband and her sons. Now, Miss Sheehan had previously worked in a hospital where she had suffered some sort of fall. It wasn't really kind of determined what the fall was, and she had some sort of ill health. And they said, quote, whether arising from that or otherwise the fall. He said that the jury would hear from many witnesses who had seen Miss Sheehan around the time of her death. He also said that she had developed some, quote, eccentricities and had some obsessions about the nearby hospital. And as a result of that, she was often seen out on the roads near her home and on public streets attempting to wave down cars to talk to people about the perceived goings on at the hospital, which she was concerned about. And he said that she would be described kind of in modern words as a vulnerable person. Detailing the evidence that would be heard, he said that she had suffered a dog bite on her arm. So she separated two dogs that were fighting near her home on that day. And because of that bite in her arm, she had to go to the hospital where, a nurse dressed the wound and they gave her a tetanus shot. And the nurse who saw to her that day gave evidence to say that she had been in the hospital. She was very thankful. She wanted to leave money in the donation box. She seemed fine. She went about her way. And that was around 9 or 10 o'clock that night. Another person we heard from was the very first witness to come actually on the stand was her son, James, who is now 65, but at the time was only 23 years of age when his mother went missing. And he reported her missing at the Garda station in Togar on the 9th of June. So 3 days after she had gone missing, he had been called, somebody had called into his work and tell him that his dad was looking for him. So he had to go home. Obviously back then, no mobile phones.
Yeah.
And he again clarified that his mom had worked in a psychiatric hospital and had suffered a fall there, but couldn't remember what part of her exactly was injured. And he again elaborated the fact that his mother was, a bit eccentric. So this is obviously the prosecution wanting to, emphasize or kind of lay out the facts that this was a very vulnerable person.
Mm-hmm. That was definitely, highlighted during the prosecution case that she was a vulnerable person. And we'd later go on to hear how she was seen on the road, almost wandering later that night when she disappeared. This is a cold case. And, I think the age of some of the witnesses has been intriguing, along with the evidence, which of course, the evidence on this case, and we have spoken about it before, is very much heavily leaning on DNA and forensic evidence. But one of the Garda sergeants that would have been on the case at the time, all the way back in 1981, was a man called John B. O'Sullivan. An 83-year-old got into the stand and he gave some evidence which I suppose gave us not only, what he could recall of that night and what happened, but also a little look back into a kind of a quainter, maybe Ireland, when his wife went with him to the crime scene.
Absolutely, yeah. Like you said, this case happened in 1981. It is, from what I believe to be probably the oldest murder case to be prosecuted in the state.
To date, is it?
To date.
Yeah.
And the fact that this guard was actually living at I'm sure it happens still in some small, as you would call them, one-horse towns down the country.
I don't ever call anywhere a one-horse town. I was burnt before on that.
I would say there are still guards living in the stations. But yeah, he's now 83. And he went on the stand and he said, that two men who were forestry workers arrived at the Garda station in Shannon in a tractor at around 3 o'clock on June 12th. And they said that they were forestry workers and they wanted to make a report about something that didn't look too good at all. Now, they originally said they thought that they had found a deceased pig, but then they realised that it was actually a body. So when they get to the station, he heads off, I believe, in his car with his wife and the two forestry workers to bring them to show him where the body is. But the reason he brought his wife, of course, was because he had said that he needed somebody, if he had to stay and secure the scene, obviously if this was a deceased body, he couldn't just leave it and go back and find help himself. He had to, stay there. So
he's the only guy in the station.
The only guy in the station. So the idea was his wife would drive back with the forestry workers and she'd be able to contact, a superintendent or, somebody higher up, because it was such a small station. They probably didn't really deal with any murders. And, even at then probably didn't even deal with that many deceased bodies. Like even if it wasn't, if somebody just had a heart attack.
Anything like, the cases today, but they pulled up 2.5 miles away, I think he said, at Shiphole Woods beside the Bandon River. And it was there. That is the crime scene that we're talking about in this trial. I think he said the body wasn't visible from the road, but he could see a navy coat lying in the briars. And about 20 yards in from the road, he discovered the body of Nora.
Yeah, so there was a kind of a steep slope down to the river, and he did note as well that he had to use a hurley to beat, that he just happened to have in the boot of his car, to beat away the blue bottles so that he could actually get in and see the body. And again, those briars that you mentioned, you know, that forms part of what Dr. Cassidy was saying about the scratches on the back, the superficial scratches, meaning that she believes that the body was dragged. But yeah, he said, you know, he noted that the body, he was the first kind of responder almost on the scene, you know, from that point of view. So he had noted that it looked like her clothes are partially pulled off, and you could see her tights at the end of one of her feet. And he also noted that bandage that she had from her injury with the dog. And he also said there was a cut to her neck and there was blood, but it didn't seem to be congealed. And he also said that he noted some of the scrape marks on her torso. So at that point then his wife went away to contact Gardaí in Bandon to tell them what was
He
found.
was right to bring his wife, according to his evidence. He stayed indeed to secure the scene and sent her back to kind of raise the alert. Yeah.
So this is obviously something, again, back then, no mobile phones, no way of contacting. He would have had to fax or call a landline. So yeah, he noted that the top had been knocked off some of the grass that was growing on the side of the road. Now there was a low stone wall as well, and there was only kind of a narrow verge for a car to pull in on the side of the river. And he also said that on the other side there was kind of a bit of a wider area, but the coat was something that was it was a coat and a shoe, I believe, that were kind of trailed down almost towards the river.
So now, as the case has come to its conclusion, we will hear the closing arguments of the state. They will lay out their case as they have done over the course. They will kind of, I suppose, for the jury, they will, go back over all the evidence they've heard and point out what the state believes to be significant as part of their case. And then it will be up to the defence to give their closing speech, and they will do likewise, but in their case, they will challenge, of course, murder. If somebody's found guilty of murder, it is beyond reasonable doubt. It's the most serious charge that anybody can face in this state. So a jury have to be convinced of the guilt and that the prosecution have proved their case beyond reasonable doubt. And usually then the judge will address the jury and will, before he sends them off to start their deliberations. So, look, how long is a piece of string? You never know how long a jury will go out for, how long these closing speeches, but there's a chance that we could see a conclusion to this case by either at the end of this week or possibly early next week. And Noel Long, who has denied murdering Nora Sheehan, will know the outcome of the case.
Absolutely. I mean, they're going away to consider, while circumstantial, there is some circumstantial evidence, and that, which is obviously evidence, but that is kind of around these eccentricities that Miss Nora Sheehan had, kind of around stuff like that. But there is a lot of forensic evidence.
They have a lot of forensic and DNA.
Yeah, so they have paint scrapings that were found on Miss Sheehan's body that were all, matched to Noel Long's car. They have Noel Long's sperm was found. It was a partial match to Noel Long, the sperm that was found inside her vagina. They have that to consider as well. Which
absolutely. Well, thanks a million, Clodagh.
Thank you.